A very good morning, my dear students. Today we will discuss intracellular gram-negative bacilli. The word itself tells you, intracellular tells you that these bacteria cannot survive outside cells. And which cells are they tropic for? They may be tropic for endothelial cells, for vascular smooth muscle cells, for monocytes, granulocytes, neutrophils, macrophages, epithelial cells, reticuloendothelial system cells, and so on. Now, most of these are obligate intracellular gram-negative bacilli, but in certain situations, the bacteria is a facultative intracellular bacteria. For example, here what you're seeing is that the bacteria are growing in an artificial medium. You're not seeing them inside any particular cell. However, they have the ability to invade reticuloendothelial system. They have ability to invade macrophages and so on, so forth. So they can survive inside cells as well as outside cells. On the other hand, as you can see over here, that this particular bacteria is growing inside a monocyte. And here you can see an epithelial cell inside which the bacteria is growing in the cytoplasm in the form of a inclusion body. So the first two slides are showing you pictures of obligate intracellular gram-negative bacilli, while the third picture is showing you a bacteria which can survive in both situations, and that is why we use the word facultative intracellular bacilli. We have seen this slide before, so we need not go into the details of this. However, we will be discussing bacteria which utilize one of the three systems to survive inside a cell. We have seen this slide as well. We'll just quickly see this. So Listeria and Rickettsia, they are phagocytosed, and then they quickly escape from the phagosome and survive in the cytoplasm. Then there are some bacteria which remain in the phagosome, but they prevent the fusion with the lysosome and continue to multiply and survive in the phagosome. So M. tuberculosis, chlamydia, legionella belong to this group. And then you have this extreme variety of pathogens which have survived, have learned to survive in extremely harsh conditions where the lysosome has fused with the phagosome and they're exposed to all the radicals, free radicals, and all the lysosome will burst enzymes and they still multiply in that. And you have Coxiella, Salmonella typhi, and M. leprae in this group. Now, the first bacteria we will discuss is Rickettsiaceae. It is named after Howard Taylor Ricketts, who studied Rocky Mountain spotted fever, which is one of the very, very severe fevers associated with rickettsia. The case mortality is somewhere between 25% to 40%. And what you can see here is that he dedicated his whole life to identification of this terrible disease, and he injected himself several times with the pathogens. So if you remember our tutorial on germ theory and Koch's postulates, so we had touched that at times one uses human volunteers, and some of these dedicated scientists did not use any other person but used themselves. So he injected himself several times with this pathogen, and in 1910 he injected himself once again, isolated the bacteria, but died of the disease. So hats off to such people, such dedicated people who went on to identify very tiny bacteria which would not grow on artificial medium, and one had to actually culture them in the human body. So what is rickettsia? Rickettsia is an obligate intracellular gram-negative bacilli. You can see it's really tiny, it is pleomorphic, and the size is zero point 0.3 to zero point 0.4 micron. It is not stained by grams, it is stained readily with Giemsa and Jimenez. And here you understand that this bacteria is not spread from person to person, it is spread through arthropod vectors. And which vectors are we talking about? It is a large spectrum of vectors from fleas, lice, ticks, and mites. And how do they spread? They spread from the portal of entry, that is where the insect bites the human being. From there, they move to the regional lymph nodes, and from there to the bloodstream. And the final target of this bacteria is the endothelial cells. And when they multiply in the endothelial cells, they degenerate, there is thrombosis, and one of the common presentations is a maculopapular rash and hemorrhage, which is what, uh, if you're suspecting a rickettsial infection, then the general physical examination, where we look for these very characteristic rashes, which gives you a clue. And here are the pictures of the tick, the flea, the lice, and the mite. And you can see the rickettsia in the host cell, as we have shown you earlier as well. So there are five medically important genera. There's Rickettsia, Orientia, Ehrlichia, Coxiella, and Bartonella. Earlier we knew them only as Rickettsia, but as molecular studies became more advanced, we have now understood that they are genetically quite distinct, and they have been classified into five different families, of which the first three, Rickettsia, Orientia, Ehrlichia, are obligate intracytoplasmic parasites. They all grow in cell lines or embryo cell cultures, and all except Coxiella are transmitted by arthropod vectors. So except for Coxiella, which is unusual and it spreads by the route of inhalation, all the others are transmitted by arthropod vectors. And the obligate intracytoplasmic parasites will not grow on artificial medium. Bartonella, on the other hand, can grow on artificial medium. So let's see quickly which cells do these bacteria parasitize. We have established that there are intracellular bacteria, obligate intracellular pathogens. Now let's just see which cells do they parasitize. So Rickettsia, classically endothelial cells. So you must understand that since it's endothelial cells, they are going to multiply and rupture. So one of the symptoms is maculopapular rash with hemorrhages. Coxiella infects the macrophages, Bartonella, the endothelial cells and the red blood cells, Chlamydia, the squamous epithelial cells and macrophages, Brucella, the macrophages and the cells of the reticuloendothelial system, Ehrlichia, the WBCs, monocytes and granulocytes, Mycobacterium tuberculosis, the macrophages, M. leprae, macrophages, and Salmonella typhi, the reticuloendothelial system. So if you see the slide, you will find something very interesting here, that some of them, the latter four or five, actually go and parasitize the very cells which are supposed to protect us from bacteria. So you've got macrophages, monocytes, granulocytes, macrophages, and reticular endothelial system. So this tells you how virulent these bacteria are and how smart they are, that they go and actually infect and multiply in these kind of cells. Now, in the cytoplasm, we've established that it is multiplying in the cytoplasm. Now, let us see exactly where. And is it only the cytoplasm, or is it some other site as well? So, the bacteria are phagocytosed by the endothelial cells. We're talking about Rickettsia here, and replicate in the following sites. So, Rickettsia has several bacteria, and they're divided into the typhus group and the spotted fever group. So, the typhus group multiplies in the cytoplasm, and the spotted fever group multiplies both in the cytoplasm and the nucleus. Coxiella in the phagolysosomes. Go back to the second slide where we discussed that these are the extreme pathogens which can survive, not only survive, but thrive in an extremely harsh environment. So Coxiella multiplies in the phagolysosomes and Ehrlichia in the phagosomes. The characteristic feature is the endothelial damage and vasculitis. So there will be development of maculopapular skin rashes, perivascular tissue necrosis, thrombosis, and ischemia. So you must understand that when there is damage to the endothelial cell, the platelets and the immune system and the homeostasis system will come and try to repair that damage. And so that repair will lead to platelet deposition with thrombosis, and then there can be actually a blocking of the blood vessels, which will lead to ischemia and which can then lead to even gangrene. And then, of course, perivascular tissue necrosis. There's going to be perivascular inflammation, which can lead to necrosis. And you can see the tick, which is so tiny, and you can compare it to the adult thumb. And the problem with it is that it's not painful. It can stick there for several days and spread infection. Diseases caused by rickettsia are all characterized by fever, headache, nausea, vomiting, myalgia, and usually a rash. So when you see this, what you can understand is it's a very non-specific symptoms. Yeah. So it could be a viral infection, which is always usually associated with these kind of symptoms. So one has to have a very strong sense of suspicion before one starts thinking of rickettsia. So if you're living in a particular geographic locale which has these reservoirs, the ticks, the lice, the mites, and so on, and you know that this area is endemic for this disease, then you start suspecting it before other infections like viruses. And in today's world, why is it important that we know it? Is because although rickettsia is not really a big problem in the Middle East, but then you know that the kind of travel we're doing now is much more than ever before, and a person can get infected, say in the Americas, where this is a common disease, and come back here incubating the disease and then manifest the symptoms in, say, Oman. So unless we know what are these symptoms and we understand with the history of travel, so when you take a history, you always take a history of travel as well. So you take the travel history and you say, all right, he went to the eastern coast of USA, and maybe he has this kind of infection. So we need to be aware of diseases far away as well, because we never know who's come from where. So disease, let us see the disease and compare the reservoir and the vector. In the typhus group, it is Rickettsia prowazekii, and it causes epidemic typhus. That is, it can spread into a kind of an epidemic. The reservoirs are the small mammals and rodents, and the vector here is the louse. The spotted fever group is a much more dangerous group, and the pathogen is Rickettsia rickettsii. It causes Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Again, the reservoir is a rodent, and the tick, which is a vector, is also the reservoir. That is, it can harbor this bacteria, and there can be transstadial transmission. That is, it can move from the mother tick to the daughter tick, and thus survive. And rickettsial pox is caused by Rickettsia cari, reservoir is mice, and the vector is mite. This is not such a severe disease, and sometimes it can be missed again if we do not know the exact symptoms and correlation of those symptoms with the pathogen. Let us see what is the pathogenesis like. So we know that rickettsia enters through the bite or feces of infected arthropod vector. They then enter the bloodstream, and once they reach the endothelial cells, they attach to them by a receptor called outer membrane protein A or outer membrane protein B. Once they multiply inside the endothelial cells, they will lead to multifocal areas of endothelial injury, which will lead to loss of intravascular fluid into tissue spaces, which will manifest with edema. Now, once the tissue, the fluid has extravasated out, what is going to happen to the blood volume? So there's going to be resultant loss in blood volume, which will lead to hypotension, which can also ultimately, if not controlled on time with vasopressors, lead to shock. Reduced perfusion of organs will, of course, will be the next thing which happens, and this can lead to multi-organ failure and disordered function of the tissues with the damaged blood vessels, like encephalitis may develop, pneumonitis, renal damage, hemorrhagic rash, of course, is a common presentation. So coming to Rickettsia prowazekii, which is the cause for epidemic typhus, the patient will present with severe headache, chills, and fever. On general physical examination, apart from other things, one will look for the macular papular rash. So there are subcutaneous hemorrhages due to invasion of the blood vessels. What is the distribution of rash? It starts at the upper trunk and spreads to involve the whole body, except the face, palms of the hands, and soles of the feet. Very important, so that once you have this, that's there on the trunk and whole body, but not the palms and the soles, etc. One can start saying, okay, it could be Rickettsia prowazekii. Now, one of the symptoms which can point to epidemic typhus is mental confusion and myocarditis. So the word typhus means mental confusion, and it is a characteristic complication of this disease. Sometimes only when the complication develops will one start thinking of it. But now that you know about this disease, if you associate it with travel, one can correlate it before the complications arise. Rocky Mountain spotted fever caused by rickettsia rickettsii is a potentially fatal disease. It again presents with severe headache, chills, fever, myalgia, nausea, rash. So many diseases can present like this. It is very difficult to correlate it otherwise unless we see the characteristic maculopapular rash. And the distribution is very interesting because it starts from the extremities, including the palms and the soles, and spreads to the chest and abdomen. So if one can see the rashes and see the distribution, it becomes very simple to diagnose it. However, sometimes the rashes may not be present, and one needs to be very, very careful about the diagnosis and suspicious about this particular disease. So, the progression of rash is rather drastic. So petechiae with hemorrhages in the skin and mucous membranes, which leads to vascular damage as the organism invades the blood vessels. And the complications are pneumonitis, CNS involvement, myocarditis, renal failure, disseminated intravascular coagulation. So a lot of organs are affected, and the failure of these organs can lead to mortality, and death may occur due to either kidney or heart failure by the end of second week if the person is not treated on time. So that means index of suspicion has to be very high, and one needs to start treating it before the complications arise, because once the complications arise, it becomes difficult to stabilize the patient. Rickettsial pox is transmitted by the mouse vector, by the mouse mite. The reservoir is a mouse, and here the characteristic rash is a papule, which is followed by eschar at the site of bite. So an eschar is the site where the vector bit, so the mice bit. There is inflammation. Usually, you know that there's redness and inflammation, but the characteristic finding here is the eschar, and eschar means that black uh, center, black necrotic center, which is very characteristic of rickettsial pox. It is also very characteristic of anthrax, but anthrax is not an intracellular pathogen, and we are not studying it today. The symptoms are again fever, malaise, headache, and it is followed by a vesicular rash, which is similar to chickenpox. So you're not seeing a hemorrhagic petechial rash, you're seeing a vesicular rash, that is a thin walled rash which is filled with translucent fluid, which is what one sees in chickenpox. There is regional lymphadenopathy, and the disease is mild, usually not fatal. And this is the kind of vesicular rash you will see. So there is a thin wall, and then you can see inside clear liquid, and that's how the chickenpox vesicle also looks. Now, how do we diagnose this bacteria? Now, you need to keep in mind that these bacteria are bacteria which do not grow on artificial medium. So, one of the good things one can do is try to do direct microscopy. One could do serology, cell culture, and DNA amplification. So, direct microscopy has a big role to play because somebody comes to you with acute symptoms. Serology will take at least a week to develop, the antibodies will take at least a week. So that if I'm looking for antibodies, it's not such a good idea. But if I'm looking for antigens, then that is something one could do. Cell culture is time consuming, it is labor intensive, it requires a high degree of laboratory setup, not possible in most diagnostic centers. It is usually done in a reference laboratory. DNA amplification is coming in, slightly expensive, but maybe within 10 years or so, one may be doing a lot of cultures, especially for bacteria which do not grow easily, viruses which don't grow at all on artificial medium. DNA amplification may become the tool of choice in the next coming 10 years. So serology is what was historically the tool which was used for detection of rickettsia. And the one test which was used was Wheel Felix heterophile antibody test. It is based on cross reactivity between Proteus and rickettsia. So you have been introduced to Proteus in the gram-negative bacilli lecture. It belongs to family Enterobacteriaceae, and there are certain Proteus which are not motile. And those non-motile variants, OX2, OXK, OX19, they have a carbohydrate stable antigens, heat stable, carbohydrate stable antigens, which strangely enough react with rickettsia. All right. Now, when antigens of one set of bacteria reacts with the, are common or share a common molecular structure with another bacteria, the word we use is heterophile. Now, Proteus is easy to grow. Rickettsia, is not easy to grow. And once you know that this particular antigen is very similar to that, we can use it for antigen antibody reactions. So we take the patient's serum, which will contain antibodies to rickettsia, and we will react it with the Proteus antigens I have just mentioned. And if we see a reaction, we say that this person is infected with one of the rickettsias. All right. However, it was not very discriminatory. It was not one of the best tests to use. And now we have indirect immunofluorescence, which detects antibodies. It can discriminate between IgM and IgG, which help in early diagnosis. So now you know that IgM is the antibody which rises first. So in acute infection, it will be IgM, which helps tell you that this is a acute infection, as against IgG, which rises later. IgG, in fact, stays for very long time, may stay for life, and so it tells you that this person was infected with a particular microbe, but it does not tell you whether it is an acute infection or not. IgM, on the other hand, tells you it's an acute infection. So a person comes to you with high-grade fever, with malaise, nausea, vomiting, chills, you thinking it's rickettsia, you would like to do this test and look for IgM. Now, direct immunofluorescence is an even better test because it detects antigens in the biopsy tissue. It is most useful and can diagnose disease in 3 to 4 days of illness, and it is 100% specific and 70% sensitive. Molecular tool, of course, is PCR. And if I'm in a reference laboratory, or if I'm not just a diagnostic, but I'm trying to develop antigens or I'm trying to develop a vaccine, then I need to culture. All right. If I'm just trying to identify a pathogen, I need to do just serology or PCR. But if I'm trying to develop a kit for diagnosis, I'm trying to develop a vaccine, I need to culture, I need to have that live bacteria. So how will I grow it? I can grow it on tissue culture systems and the hen's eggs, and animal models are the guinea pigs and mice. Now we come to Ehrlichia, which used to earlier belong to family Rickettsiaceae, but now we know it's a different family altogether. Again, it is a small gram-negative obligate intracellular parasite, and there are two species you need to be aware of: Ehrlichia phagocytophila and Ehrlichia schaffensis. Ehrlichia phagocytophila infects the human granulocytes, and thus it's called HGE. It is transmitted by Ixodes ticks. The reservoir is deer, cattle, sheep, and E. schaffensis is in human monocytic, causes human monocytic ehrlichiosis. The vector here is amblyomma tick, and the reservoir is again deer. Again, it's more common in the United States of America. It multiplies to form mulberry-shaped aggregates or morulae. So here in a peripheral smear, one can see this kind of a picture, and it tells us that this bacteria has caused this infection. So morulae is a very characteristic appearance in a peripheral smear, and it is practically diagnostic. Person will have lymphadenopathy, hepatosplenomegaly with leukopenia and thrombocytopenia with complication of disseminated intravascular coagulation. Again, the laboratory diagnosis, peripheral smear, we've discussed it. It could be serology, cell culture, DNA amplification, but in a diagnostic laboratory, one tries to resort to the first two. Now, Coxiella burnetii was initially called Q fever because nobody understood what was the pathogen which was causing this set of diseases. And then subsequently, one understood that this bacteria is Coxiella burnetii. It is primarily a zoonosis. A zoonosis means that the disease is of animals. Now, what type of animals should we be concerned about? Animals which live near man. So, domesticated animals. Man has the greatest risk of getting infected from domesticated animals. So, cattle, sheep, goat is the type of animals which get infected with this. So, the primary disease is in animals. And what type of occupations will you be thinking of? You will be thinking of farmers, dairy workers, veterinarians, and so on. Route of infection is inhalation of infectious material. It could also be by ingestion of contaminated milk. And how does a person get it by inhalation? The placentas of these animals are, are hugely infected by Coxiella burnetii. So once an animal delivers and the placenta is delivered and the air itself contains a large number of these bacteria which are very tiny droplet nuclei, and a person can inhale them and get infected. And once, of course, inhalation is the primary route, one of the common presentations will be pneumonia. Now, these bacteria are intracellular parasites of macrophages, and as we discussed, they're resistant to lysosomal enzymes. There is sudden onset of fever, chills, headache, but no rash. Now, do understand fever, chills, headache could just be malaria. I've just talked only about viruses here, but it could simply be malaria. So, depending on the country you are living in, you'll have a different set of differential diagnosis for the same set of symptoms. So, one needs to increase that differential diagnosis and keep unusual pathogens like Coxiella burnetii as well. The disease presentations could be atypical pneumonia, could be CNS involvement, and could be endocarditis. All right. And one needs to keep all these in mind. And of course, the route of infection, so that it causes CNS infection and endocarditis, is bloodstream. How will we diagnose it? It will be by isolation in cell lines. One can grow them in animals, look for antibody detection, and of course, molecular tools. Now we come to Bartonella quintana, first isolated by Vinson in 1916. And again, this person used to self inoculate the bacteria and of course also recruited human volunteers, and this was done to prove the Koch's postulates. Luckily, the disease is usually not fatal. So as against Howard Ricketts, this person luckily survived. The diseases associated with Bartonella quintana are trench fever, bacillary angiomatosis, which is a recent discovery. It causes neovascularization, often occluding blood flow, and it is also associated with endocarditis. Bartonella quintana causes trench fever. It is also transmitted by body lice. So what you see here is that epidemic typhus and Bartonella quintana are both spread by body lice. And how does that happen? The lice bites the person, and it's funny, the lice bites and defecates at the bites, that is feeds and defecates at the same time, and the feeding is what leads to the itching, and the person scratches, and when the person scratches, the feces which contain the live bacteria are then auto inoculated through the process of scratching. Both these infections, that is Bartonella quintana and epidemic typhus, are classical bacteria associated with poverty, with war, with famine. So both of them were actually a major problem during both World War I and II. And unfortunately, with the rise in poverty, it is said that both of them may be becoming re-emerging, may soon be becoming re-emerging bacteria. Bartonella are fastidious, slow-growing, facultative intracellular gram-negative bacilli. So the word facultative has arrived here. That means they can grow both intracellularly and extracellularly, and recent research is saying that it's more epicellular bacteria than a classic intracellular bacteria. What does it invade? It invades RBCs and other cells and also leads to bacteremia. Now, the symptoms which are associated with Bartonella quintana are headache, severe exhaustion, leg pains and leg stiffness, and high grade relapsing fever. Now, if a soldier gets these kind of symptoms, you can understand that that person will not be able to be actively in the war front and will have to go back to recover. So, a lot of wars which were fought were lost because of Bartonella quintana and epidemic typhus, because the soldiers did not succumb to actual wounds but succumbed to such infections. A roseolar rash occurs and the patient usually recovers. So that's the good thing with Bartonella quintana as against epidemic typhus, where the case fatality rate is much higher. Again, a common complication is endocarditis, and this bacteria, as you know, can be grown on artificial medium. Now we come to chlamydia. Chlamydia are even more amazing bacteria because they don't even synthesize their own ATP. So they're called energy parasites. They do not infect the macrophages and endothelial cells. They infect the squamous epithelial cells, and you can see the inclusion bodies in this particular slide. So the when let's see look at the classification: order Chlamydiales, genus Chlamydia. It's an obligate intracellular parasite, ATP parasite. Cell walls are similar to gram-negative bacteria but lack muramic acid, have a complex developmental cycle, and it has two forms. One is the infective form called the elementary body. It induces phagocytosis, and there's a replicative form which multiplies inside the phagocytic vesicle. So this is the life cycle. Elementary body is what will infect. It is hardy, it is tough, it is resistant to the external environment, it is not easily killed, it will infect the epithelial cell, and then it will change into the reticulocytes, which are soft bodied, they are very fragile, they will be killed if they are outside the cell. But the reticulocytes have the ability to multiply quickly, and they multiply inside this mantle, and chlamydia means a mantle. All right, so it grows inside this and ultimately becomes really large. The nucleus is pushed to the side, and once the desired number are produced, you will find that it will burst. So what desired number? So one, initially the reticulate bodies will multiply, and then they will start changing to elementary bodies once more. And when all the reticulate bodies have changed to elementary bodies, then they will disperse and spread infection further. There are several serotypes on the basis of the major outer membrane proteins. So there is serotypes A to K and L1, 2, 3. A lot of these are sexually transmitted infections. So non-gonococcal urethritis is caused by D to K. So that means the word non-gonococcal tells you that the primary urethritis is caused by Neisseria gonorrhoeae, and then Chlamydia trachomatis is associated with non-gonococcal urethritis, and the serotypes are D to K. There is lymphogranuloma venereum, which is a much more serious disease. It is caused by L1, 2, 3. Chlamydia can also cause eye infections, and it was the commonest cause of blindness apart from cataract, and it is called trachoma, and it is caused by serotypes A to C. Neonatal infections are also associated with Chlamydia trachomatis, and one is neonatal inclusion conjunctivitis, and there is neonatal pneumonia. So you've understood that it is a STD, And once it's an STD, it also tells you that once the child is being born through the birth canal and the mother is harboring this bacteria, the child is likely to get infected. So one of the infections could be conjunctivitis, the other infection could be neonatal pneumonia. Again, the diagnosis, the first one is microscopy, serology, cell culture, and DNA amplification. Direct microscopy is by iodine stain or GeneSus stain. And now, of course, we're using direct immunofluorescence antibody test, which is the test of choice now. It's in fact a gold standard for diagnosing chlamydia. We can culture it in the yolk sac of 6 to 8 day old chick embryo. It can also be grown in tissue cultures like McCoy and HeLa cell lines, but you need to irradiate it or prevent it from multiplying. So your cell lines should not be multiplying, and that's where chlamydia can grow. So cycloheximide treated cell lines, irradiated cell lines are used for growing chlamydia trachomatis. Now we come to Legionella pneumophila, which is a relatively new bacteria. People did not know about it until 1976, where there was an outbreak of atypical pneumonia at the Philadelphia Convention of American Legion. So American Legion is this war veterans, the celebrated war veterans were meeting at this very lovely convention called the Philadelphia Convention. Now, of course, they were all elderly people, and there a large number of them developed the Legionnaire's disease. So then this particular bacteria was identified. So this bacteria thrives in slow moving stagnant water at 20 to 50 degrees centigrade. Again, an intracellular pathogen. It's not an obligate, it's a facultative intracellular pathogen, likes to live in macrophages and alveolar cells, inhibits the phagosome lysosome fusion. And the diseases caused by it are Pontiac fever, atypical pneumonia, involves multi organs, and can present with symptoms of GI tract, CNS, liver, kidneys, and the case fatality rate is pretty high, 15% in healthy individuals, 75% in the immunocompromised. For example, diabetics, elderly, or on chemotherapy, etc., are more susceptible. So this is an opportunistic disease and affects people with underlying illness or weak immune system. So middle-aged, elderly, people with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, smokers were the most susceptible. Reservoir of infection, interestingly here, were the cooling towers of the air conditioning system. So the air conditioning systems were not being cleaned regularly. This bacteria would love to grow in that. And in where the hot water lines are mixing with the soil and water. So it grows in the cooling towers of air conditioning systems, in the hot water lines, so 20 to 50 degrees centigrade. It can also live in soil and water. And it is a nosocomial infection. So if the hospital's air conditioning is not cleaned properly, this could be a source of infection. So stagnant waters, showers, dead ends, that's where this bacteria loves to grow. So poor hygiene, infrequently used washing areas which are prone to scaling. This is where Legionella will multiply. What is the life cycle of Legionella pneumophila? You can see it is entering through a type 4 secretion system. It is inside the phagosome, right? And then it starts multiplying inside the phagosome, and within 14 hours it is able to burst and infect neighboring cells. So it inhibits the phagosome lysosome fusion, allowing intracellular growth. The endotoxin inhibits generation of peroxide in the phagocytic cells, and thus it allows it to multiply. Again, microscopy, serology, cell culture, DNA amplifications can be used. You can see that this bacteria is small and pleomorphic. By pleomorphic, what do we mean? That of course it's a gram-negative bacilli, but at times it can be nice, long, filamentous. All right, and it stains poorly with gram-negative stains. So a better stain is a direct fluorescent antibody test, which you can see over here, and you can see the bright green fluorescence, which is typical of Legionella. However, urinary antigen is a very useful test. It is rapid, easy, and cheap to do. So, if you're suspecting somebody has Legionella, a sample of urine is collected, and one can do a urinary antigen test by immunochromatographic method, which is very sensitive and easy to perform. If one wants to culture this bacteria, one will use buffered charcoal yeast extract agar in CO2, and in CO2 means we'll incubate it in an environment of CO2. We will put antibiotics to inhibit the other bacteria from growing, and you can see these dark colored colonies which are suggestive of Legionella. Of course, molecular tools are playing a big role in today's world for identification, especially if there is an outbreak. One would like to quickly do molecular identification. Now we come to Brucella, which is a bacteria which is endemic to Oman, and we should all be very clear. So once a person comes to you with a set of symptoms which are suggestive of brucella and maybe suggestive of other diseases as well, your differential diagnosis should be brucella first. So what is brucella? It is a small gram-negative cocobacilli. It is non-motile, aerobic, and capnophilic. Capnophilic means it likes to grow in the presence of carbon dioxide. It is again primarily a zoonosis, and in Middle East it grows also in camels. So you'll have camel, cattle, sheep, goat, swine, etc. It can grow in any one of them. It's a facultative intracellular pathogen and goes and resides in cells of the reticuloendothelial system. It survives within macrophages, and it inhibits again the phagosome lysosome fusion. What are the cultural and biochemical characteristics? It requires some complex medium like Brucella blood agar. It is oxidase and catalase positive, it is H2S positive, and it produces urease enzyme. It's a notifiable category 3 zoonosis. The three species you should be aware of are Brucella abortus, Brucella melitensis, and Brucella suis. Now, the diseases associated with symptoms rather associated with brucella are non-specific symptoms. So it could be fatigue, weight loss, weakness, fever, chills, rigors, abdominal pain, diarrhea, vomiting. So can you see the similarity of the symptoms which we have been seeing all through, except for, of course, Legionnaire's disease, where the primary symptoms will be of pneumonia. Again, Coxiella, maybe the primary symptoms will be of pneumonia, but in all the others, it is fever, chills, rigors. Now, of course, here you've got fatigue, weight loss, and weakness, which means it's a chronic disease. So somebody cannot develop weight loss within a fever of 4 days, 5 days. So this tells you immediately it's a chronic disease. So brucella can present as acute and as chronic, and one could think of weight loss fever in tuberculosis as well. So it is called undulant fever. It can present with typhoid-like fever. Musculoskeletal symptoms may mean that the person is thinking, oh, I've developed arthritis, osteoarthritis, and so on and so forth. One can present with depression, when a person can also have endocarditis because of brucella. So if you go through the slides, you'll find that endocarditis is playing a big role in a large number of these bacteria. And the cause is, of course, that this bacteria is entering the bloodstream. So one needs to be very, very vigilant when we are thinking of brucella. And since brucella is so common here, you need to, somebody comes to you with backache, you may think it's just backache and you may just send him for physiotherapy, but then it's better to also look for brucella, depression, endocarditis, fever. It's a very good idea to have a strong index of suspicion and rule out brucella rather than think, no, 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 it can't be brucella, because the word, what I would like to tell you is that brucella has very protean manifestations, very different type, very strange manifestations, no typical presentation. Now, serology, cell culture, and DNA amplification are routinely used for brucella, of which cell culture and serology are the most important. So, in this case, one will take a blood culture. And if you remember your brucella from tutorial, so blood culture where we incubated it for 21 days, but now with BACTEC coming in, one can identify it much faster. If one doesn't have BACTEC, then one uses this kind of a bottle which is called Castaneda, which has two media in two phases, solid medium and liquid medium. Now, this is again, all these bacteria which I have mentioned to you today are very infectious and can spread. When the laboratory workers have to be very careful so that they do not get infected, and one needs to work in biohazard safety 3 biohazard, so that the persons don't get infected. So for that reason, this bacteria which we are growing here is in this kind of medium, and it is in a glass bottle. So if something is growing here, I don't need to open the bottle. I will subculture by tilting the bottle, and so if the broth has some bacteria, the agar will get inoculated and the bacteria will be able to grow. So that's the advantage of Castaneda. And if we grow it on Brucella agar, one will see these tiny little colonies of Brucella which take about 3 days to grow. Apart from blood culture, we can use serology where we look for IgM, and one can look for IgG as well. Molecular tools play a big role. And then in animals, because it's a zoonosis and a farmer would like to know whether his animals are infected, one will need to then take some drastic measures for as far as animals are concerned. So one can detect it by the Rose Bengal card test. What is the treatment? Now, the treatment here is not your routine penicillin and so on. Please see what we are using here. We're using doxycycline and chloramphenicol for rickettsia, doxycycline and erythromycin for chlamydia. For Legionella, it is erythromycin and tetracycline. And for Brucella, we're using streptomycin, which is an aminoglycoside, and doxycycline. And one of the reasons is, of course, that their cell wall character is not the standard peptide. Of course, they have peptidoglycan, but not all of them have the standard peptidoglycan with which the penicillin group will work. So doxycycline works beautifully, as you can see in practically all of them. Tetracycline is nothing but the older version of doxycycline, and erythromycin is a macrolide. So the treatment is very distinct. So if you remember, the word I had used several times is atypical pneumonia. And one of the reasons why we call it atypical pneumonia is that penicillin will not kill the bacteria. Like Streptococcus pneumoniae is a typical pathogen of pneumonia. Haemophilus influenzae is a typical pathogen of pneumonia, all right? And the drug of choice would become one of the penicillins. While here, it is doxycycline and chloramphenicol here in case of rickettsia, erythromycin in case of chlamydia, and streptomycin in brucella. Just before I end, brucella, as I told you, is a chronic disease, and just like tuberculosis, we don't use it with just one drug. We want to give several drugs. So both streptomycin and doxycycline may have to be given for several weeks before one can say that this person is free of brucella. So just before we end, just a small little joke. A bacterium named Bill and his brother went out for a drink with each other. In the midst of their coughing, they split their sides, laughing, and each of them now is a mother. So that's a bacterial binary fission happening for you. Thank you. I hope you understood it. If you have any issues, please discuss with me.